like a month and a half. I was working both jobs at the same time. Yeah, so I was there probably from 7 to 3, and I'm here from 4 to midnight. So I'm doing hour tutoring today. So I close out there this week. So I was there today from 7 to 3, and I'll be here till midnight. So I really like it. Yeah, I'm definitely tired, and then I came back and it's pretty busy here now, a lot busier than I expected it to be. And so Vicky was like, never again, you're not getting off that time. So definitely a good opportunity. She didn't expect it to be Now, would you go tutoring the weekday or no? Both got 2 phones. Look at you.
Yeah.
For the secretary.
Yes, you can put it on?
Well, we can put it on, or you can come with us.
Yes.
He's here now.
Both of them?
No, one is for him, one is for Jason, correct?
Is Jason here?
Yes, he is.
Okay.
And I would say you should come in and my pocket. Okay. Probably starting. Somebody should start with Lynn Orr and John Kotek.
Thank you.
Yeah, and
Okay.
in the John Kotek, Kotek, and the other one is among my advisors. M.L. Wagner. Okay. All right. Yeah. So, okay. So he can help you hook up.
We'll follow up? Yeah, just send me.
Okay.
That's all I was asking for, and it's wonderful. Thank you, sir.
Terrific.
I love what you're doing.
Good seeing you again.
Okay. Yeah, all right. So we'll
Okay.
introduce you now.
Oh, should I? Is there water out there?
There is, yeah. Right? Yes. You're going to welcome everyone? Oh, you're not going to say anything? Oh, well, no, I thought you were going to. I mean, it's up to you. You don't have to. I'm happy
So-
to. No? Okay.
We're going to do this. I say a few minutes, 15 minutes or something like that.
Exactly, and then we'll have a
and then we have a conversation.
Exactly.
All right.
So I'm going to welcome everyone. David will introduce you, and then I'll ask you to come up.
Okay.
So I'm going to welcome everyone, turn it over to you.
Doesn't
Well,
matter.
there it said, yeah,
All right.
we'll do it.
It's better for you. Okay.
So, and then you'll introduce him.
There's water at the podium for you as well. If you need
Underneath.
it. And then up there.
Thank you.
Except for my purse is under the chair.
Okay, let me welcome everyone.
Sitting up there. I didn't know.
It's a university. They don't care
Thank you
where the
all
wire is.
for being here. We have limited time this evening with our distinguished guest, the U.S. Secretary of Energy, so I want to make sure we start on time so we can end on time. I know his schedule is tight. But it's a great pleasure on behalf of myself. My name is Jason Bordoff, professor at Columbia's School of International Public Affairs. I direct the Center on Global Energy Policy. I want to welcome our Dean, Merit Janow, here. And on behalf of Dean Janow and myself and all of our colleagues at CEPA, really a pleasure to have with us at Columbia CEPA's Center on Global Energy Policy, the U.S. Secretary of Energy, Dr. Ernest Moniz. He visited the Energy Center in the summer of 2013, in the early days of his service in the Obama administration and in the early days of the Center on Global Energy Policy. He promised us then he would return. You're cutting it a little close, but with 4 months left in the Obama
99 days.
He's counting the days, but we're truly honored to have you back with us today, sir. My colleague David Sandalo, who worked with Secretary Moniz at the Energy Department, will formally introduce him, but let me just briefly say that I think for us here at CEPA especially, where the focus is both on academic excellence and real-world policy engagement and implementation, Secretary Moniz stands out as a really unique role model for his ability to combine world-class excellence at the very highest level on both of those dimensions. He's been called a rock star, the secret weapon of the Obama cabinet, the Obama cabinet secretary the GOP can't help but like. That's a quote. And the line that I liked best about him was from his MIT colleague John Deutsch, who told the New York Times occasionally a scientist drops into the government at just the right time with just the right expertise. And at a moment when this administration has increased its ambition around climate agenda, as we heard Brian Deese talk about 2 days ago here at Columbia, at a moment when the US has reached a historic nuclear agreement with Iran, at a moment when bipartisan consensus is harder than ever to achieve, you'd be lucky to find a nuclear physicist with DC experience, good political instincts, and bipartisan respect across the aisle. And it's that rare combination, I think, that has made Secretary Moniz so effective in his job. So thank you again for joining us today. I will just say by way of housekeeping items, Secretary Moniz will speak for a bit. We'll have a conversation up here. We'll take questions from the audience written on index cards that will be collected by people and passed up to me so I can pose them to the Secretary. For those watching online, you're able to ask questions as well through Twitter at our Twitter handle at Columbia U Energy using the hashtag CGEP events. Please silence your cell phones as well. And with that, David, please.
Well, thanks. It's a lot of fun and a great privilege for me to join Jason in welcoming an extraordinary Secretary of Energy here to Columbia. Secretary Ernie Moniz brings a remarkable background to this job. He was on the faculty of MIT starting in 1973, served as chair of the physics department at MIT. He founded the MIT Energy Initiative and served in the US government in a number of senior roles. He served on the White House staff. He served as Undersecretary of Energy, where he was in charge of negotiations with the Russians on nuclear issues. He was confirmed by the US Senate as Secretary of Energy by a unanimous vote, which is no small feat in today's polarized Washington. Since then, I think he's won the greatest renown publicly for his very central role in the Iran nuclear negotiations, but has also helped to transform the Department of Energy, launching a quadrennial energy review and many other changes to the Department of Energy, which have made a big difference there. As Jason referred to, I worked in the US Department of Energy during the first Obama term. I have lots of friends and colleagues who were there. It was a great privilege to serve there. So I talk to them a lot, and I hear a lot about Secretary Moniz, and I can tell you that he is universally admired within the department. It's a pretty tough crowd, so it's not easy. They do have one complaint about you, however, sir, which I feel duty-bound to pass along here, which is they can't keep up with you. What I hear from them is Secretary stays up too late, he wakes up too early, he absorbs his briefing materials much too quickly, and he comes up with too many good new creative ideas. So I figure that may be tough on them, Mr. Secretary, but that means the rest of us are getting our money's worth. So thank you and welcome to Columbia.
Well, thank you, both Jason and David. The enthusiasm of those introductions proves that there's less than 100 days left in this administration. But it really is good to be back here at Columbia. As Jason said, I was here in August of 2013, and some water over the dam in the meantime. And in fact, particularly in two areas that I will touch on briefly so that we can get to a conversation. But it's more to tee up things, I would say. Clearly, one is what I would call actually the linked issues of climate change, energy security, and the clean energy transformation that is central to both. I'll touch on that. And then I'll touch on our responsibilities in nuclear security, in particular preventing the spread of nuclear weapons and reduction of nuclear materials at risk across the world. So again, I'll touch on just some of the key events and outcomes in these areas so that we can move on to our discussion. So first on climate. Well, Brian Deese was here. I'm not going to hopefully repeat too much of what he said, but the first point is that it is remarkable that an agreement of this type, with essentially every country in the world engaged, has gone from negotiation and agreement to implementation in less than a year. This is really remarkable, and I think it's one of the indications that we are headed to a low-carbon economy. One of my CEO friends in the utility business says, who has a lot of coal plants and other things, you can't keep the waves off the beach. That's where we're going. The country is going there, and that's really important. The Paris Agreement itself is a big first step, and I want to emphasize big, and I want to emphasize first. It's big because these commitments to a low-carbon future, again, across the globe, put us with their commitments in the 2025 to 2030 timeframe, typically with 25% or so reductions of CO2. They put us on a trajectory that will get us to the deep decarbonization that we need to be looking at mid-century and beyond. But it's only putting us on the trajectory. And ambition is going to have to keep increasing as we move forward to reach this kind of deep decarbonization. And that's where another very important part of the Paris discussions, very important, especially in our view at DOE, was what happened on the first day of Paris, which was the announcement by President Obama and the leaders of 19 other countries on something called Mission Innovation, which is a commitment to double roughly a $15 billion base of energy technology R&D to roughly $30 billion over a 5-year time period. So the idea is to really open up the innovation pipeline. Certainly in the United States, we believe that we have lots of unexercised innovation capacity. The innovation has therefore been put at the core of the solution to climate change. I want to emphasize, not in place of policy, but synergistically with policy, and I'll come back to that in a second. But also, at the same time, Bill Gates was there, representing 28 international investors with deep pockets, committing billions of dollars to invest in the fruits of that innovation, and to do it with patience, which was a failure, frankly, of Tech 1.0, Clean Tech 1.0, to do it with high risk tolerance, and to be prepared to make the large capital investments that are needed in the energy sector to begin the scale up to real commercial introduction. So it was a very big deal, and I'd say at DOE we certainly spent the 2015, the year, building up to this and noting again how innovation was central. Now, there has been an argument put forward. On the one hand, Bill Gates, for example, is often quoted as saying we need an energy miracle to address our climate needs. The comeback by many is that no, we don't. We have everything we need today, we just got to get it out there. And certainly when I'm asked my view on that, my answer is yes. It's a false dichotomy. And in particular, if we look at timescales, and I'll just pick arbitrarily, say 2030, because that's kind of the date when most of the Paris commitments were made. Can we meet our goals in the United States in 2020 and 2025 for carbon reductions with what we have today and kind of what I would call continued innovation and cost reduction? Absolutely. We need to get the right policies, especially as we go farther down the road, but absolutely. However, if we are talking about deep decarbonization, what you are often shown is the electricity sector, and it looks great. We can get 80% decarbonization. But we also need the transportation sector. We also need the industrial sector. And those are much more challenging to do. In fact, that leads me to think that we also need yet another stream, which is, I would call it large-scale carbon management. Big scale use of CO2, for example. Converting CO2 and water and sunlight to drop-in fuels. We could go on as to what many of these, we could use Bill Gates' word or not, but big transformative technologies could be. I believe they will be a crucial adjunct to the kinds of technologies that we work on, and we are having success in driving costs down. So that's really the goal. And what we have found at the department in doing some modeling is a tremendous synergy between success in the innovation agenda and policy. Because again, if you think it's only policy, let's use as a stand-in for policy generically a carbon price. There's many ways of getting there, but let's say a carbon price, nice, easy way to talk about it. And the thought is that, well, if we just crank up the carbon price higher and higher and higher, we'll get to whatever goal we want. The trouble is, I would say, number one is the impact of that becomes very inelastic as the prices get very high and consequently are not politically very easy to reach. On the other hand, when we look at innovation without policy, the time constants are too long for the introduction. But when you put them together, they tend to be nonlinear and amplify each other. And so at a much lower carbon price, for example, the innovation agenda leads to much faster introduction. So that's kind of the picture that I wanted to lay out there. And of course we can talk about it more. But that's been, I think, a very major step forward over this last couple of years. I might also say that the innovation agenda in Congress does have very strong bipartisan support. That bipartisan support over the next 5 years needs to be transformed into numbers to get that R&D budgets up, for example, to link to the private sector for investments, to get an accelerated transformation. But we start out, I think, with good bipartisan support. We start out with very strong support for one of the ideas that we have put forward, the Obama administration, in terms of executing mission innovation, and that is to use part of those resources to fund regional innovation partnerships, recognizing that the regional needs in our country are very different, and let's use the innovation resources in different ways in different parts of the country. And third, internationally, there is very strong interest. I mentioned the 20 countries, but beyond that, in fact, in the meeting just last week in London, there was an interesting discussion about ways in which, while each country will pursue its own portfolio, how they can work together to create the opportunities. Including possibly new ideas like international collaboration on prize approaches to stimulating innovation. So there's a lot happening, and innovation will be at the core of the agenda going forward. I'll just make one other aside on climate change, and that is we are hoping tomorrow in Rwanda there will be success in amending the Montreal Protocol to address hydrofluorocarbons, so that's the replacement for chlorofluorocarbons, which are solving the ozone hole problem, but are generating climate problems. And tomorrow we hope to get international agreement on that. Let's cross our fingers that will work. Let me turn briefly to energy security. I mentioned that as well. Something that has undergone quite some evolution, I would say, in the last nearly 3 years. Basically, I say nearly 3 years because for the starting point, I take the Russian incursion into Crimea and Ukraine, which set off probably an accelerated rethinking about energy security because of the concerns about natural gas in Europe and being so heavily dependent on Russia. So in the G7 context, plus the EU, very shortly after those events in early 2014, we came together in Rome, the energy ministers of the G7 plus EU, and really came forward with what I would call a modern set of principles about energy security, as opposed to the very narrow traditional focus on oil supply, which comes out of the 1970s oil shocks. And I just want to say, without going through it in detail, that the principles include things, for example, like functioning global markets as a very important component of energy security. Of course, the issue of diversity of sources and routes of supply is important, but then when you're talking about diversity of routes of supply, you are inherently talking about fossil fuels, which is why clean energy comes into this equation as well. You don't worry about your fuel supply with renewables or nuclear, for example. So that's also part of it. The questions of infrastructure improvements. In fact, that's almost part and parcel of well-functioning markets. You need to have the infrastructure to support it. That infrastructure has to recognize modern threats. Sure, there are geopolitical threats, but there's also extreme weather threats, going back to our climate discussion. There are cyber threats. There are physical threats. We need an infrastructure that supports clean energy, but is also resilient to a modern and evolving threat spectrum. And we need emergency response when the preventive measures don't work. So that's all put together in kind of a modern view of energy security. And some things have really happened even in that short time. For example, the evolution of global natural gas markets through LNG exports has really happened a lot faster than people expected. That's an element of security for us and our allies and friends. In Europe, we still do struggle with routes as there is a tension between new routes of more Russian supply versus genuinely new routes, like the so-called Southern Corridor to bring gas from the Caspian, maybe eventually the Eastern Mediterranean. But those are the kinds of discussions that have been joined in a very, very serious way in these last 3 years, especially. In terms of infrastructure and resilience at the department, our Energy Policy and Systems Analysis Office, whose director is here, last year produced what's called a Quadrennial Energy Review 1.1, which was specifically on energy infrastructure in the United States. Not a wholly pretty picture in many, many ways. We really need a big move forward. And I'll just give you a couple of examples which combine the infrastructure and issues and emergency response. For example, just last week, actually we're still in the throes of Hurricane Matthew. Hurricane Matthew knocked out about 3 million electricity customers, for example, and Hurricane Superstorm Sandy of a few years ago, of course, here had almost 9 million customers knocked out. In Superstorm Sandy, you got a very good lesson in this region about the interconnectedness of infrastructures, because without electricity for a long time, you couldn't get fuel either, even though the fuel was there. It was an important lesson. Lessons were learned. And so I'll just give the example of Florida Power and Light, where I visited there about 6 months ago. Obviously, Florida, often in the crosshairs of tropical storms and damage to energy infrastructure. They were really walking the talk. They had some federal recovery money from 2009. I think David knows about that. But they also invested their own $2 billion in everything from simple stuff like concrete poles rather than wooden poles to making the grid smarter and harder with IT. Now, we don't know yet the final audit of how this happened, how this played out, but their estimate is Hurricane Matthew would have had a lot of customers out for 10 to 15 days. Over 98% of their customers were back online within 3 days. And they think that this hardening and smartening was a big deal. They're going to invest another $2 billion over the next 3 years on this. And some of this, by the way, it applies there, but it applies elsewhere. Some of it is smart meters. Enormous deployment of smart meters. Smart meters tends to invoke the image of how you're going to pay your bill. What's critical here, it tells the utility immediately when you have an outage, and they know where to go and what to address. So this infrastructure, and in particular the integration of infrastructure with IT, is really going to pay big dividends, but we're only just scratching the surface going forward. So this is one thing. And then I'll just say, in terms of emergency response, again, I won't go into great detail, but because of this evolving threat spectrum, the Congress, for example, in December of last year, both in the highway bill, it's called the FAST Act, and in their budget bill, acknowledged the increasing role of the government and of DOE in particular to have the authorities to address these energy infrastructure emergencies. So we are doing that, but I will tell you, once again, this is a work in progress because we still haven't figured out how to align resources with responsibilities. And one of the things that I think we need to think about, the next administration needs to think about, is the possibility of a fundamental reorganization within the Department of Energy in terms of how all these emergency response activities are carried out. So we're leaving a few things for the next administration to look at. The last thing I'll say there actually is in December as well. The Congress did take one of the very resource-heavy recommendations of our Quadrennial Energy Review and provided $2 billion of funding to modernize the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. I'm going to end this part of the discussion with this, saying that going back to that earlier discussion about a modern way of looking at energy security versus the 1970s, the Petroleum Reserve was established in the 1970s, late 1970s. And people still think about it as, well, how many days of imports do I have to cover? No, what we're saying is, look, no matter how much oil we produce in the United States, and we are producing more, a lot more, we still import a lot, but we're producing a lot more, we will not be independent of the global oil price. And so a major disruption anywhere is going to affect our consumers, our economy, and that's why we still need to have things like a petroleum reserve to be able to manage that. And we can get into a longer discussion about authorities, but that's a different question. Anyway, so that's some of the stuff that's been happening certainly since I was here last in terms of the energy and climate space. Let me just switch now to nuclear security and end there. The President established a very aggressive agenda on nuclear security in his Prague speech in March 2009, shortly after he took office. And the Prague speech, the Prague agenda, laid out a broad agenda in terms of nuclear deterrence, nuclear nonproliferation, nuclear materials control, etc. Now, a centerpiece of what has evolved in the nuclear security space is the Iran agreement. I'm not going to go into detail on that, but let me just say that the fundamental architecture of the Iran agreement, which is focused specifically on the nuclear weapon threat possibility, the fundamental structure is, for 15 years, Iran has significant constraints on what it can do in a civilian, peaceful nuclear program. But transparency and verification measures are put in place, quotes, forever. So that's the basic architecture. For 15 years, constrain the program as they reestablish international confidence and trust in the peaceful nature of their program, and then have from the start to forever verification measures. In a nutshell, it's working certainly so far. Now, we're only 9 months into this, and 9 months is only a few percent of 15 years. But the fact is the IAEA, the international inspectors, have now published 3 reports that Iran is complying with its nuclear responsibilities. I do note the agreement came into force, into implementation January 16th of this year, only after the IAEA verified that Iran had fulfilled its obligations, and they were considerable. Now, one does hear from Iran the story that, well, we're not fulfilling our side. I'm making it very, very clear. We are completely fulfilling our side of the agreement. The fact that they may not be realizing the pace of economic impact that they had hoped for is due to many, many complex factors which do not include our impeding business that is allowed within the current sanctions regime in Iran. Because I want to remind you, the agreement is not criticized for what it is. Now, any criticism of it is for what it's not. Well, why didn't it solve the missile problem? Why didn't it solve the Hezbollah problem? Well, the reason is that was not part of the negotiation, just as when Reagan negotiated arms control in the 80s. It wasn't to solve all the problems we had with the Soviet Union, Jewish emigration, other proxy wars, et cetera, et cetera. The other side of that coin is, since it's only addressing the nuclear problem, only the nuclear sanctions were lifted. There are many other sanctions on Iran involving human rights and terrorism and the like, missiles. And so, for international banks and international business, they have to sort out what entities they are dealing with in a country that has not had strong banking relationships now for quite a few years. So anyway, it's moving, it's happening. Their oil production, their oil exports are very, very close to what they were pre-sanctions, for example. So that's adding to the economy, et cetera. So it's the pace of change, and hopefully these things will all come together and proceed, as we all hope, over the next 1 and 2 decades. Now, the nuclear security agenda has got much more to it. Won't spend too much time, but I mentioned earlier Russia in stimulating some additional thinking on energy security. They've also stimulated some additional thinking on nuclear security issues, unfortunately. And the reality is the next administration is going to have to face some difficult choices because there is, even though the president has, in my view, certainly the right vision of hoping for a world or working towards a world without nuclear weapons, there is no reason today to think that that's not going to be a multi-decadal activity. And so a lot of money is going to have to be spent on modernizing the nuclear deterrent and rethinking exactly how it's used. I'll just end by saying another very important part of the agenda that very much involves DOE as well is I'm hoping that in the next administration there'll be the opportunity to return to the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty. We've now maintained our deterrent, shrinking, but maintained it without testing, and it's all based upon innovation. And that's the word I wanted to end with. Innovation in the nuclear security, innovation in the energy space is what we at DOE are all about, and what I think is going to be critical to addressing these priority issues. So thank you for that, and
Thank you. Hopefully these are working. Can you hear me okay? Can we turn the mics on? Now is it working?
no. Oh, yes.
Yes? Working now? Okay. Yes? Okay. like it's working. So thank you again for making time to be here today. It's especially courageous for both you and Brian Deese to visit New York the week of the Red Sox collapse. I apologize for that.
I'm leaving.
Very sorry.
The Yankees went further than I expected, and the Red Sox not as far as I expected.
That's we'll come back to that at the end. You can explain what happened to the Red Sox in the playoffs. So you covered a lot of things I wanted to talk about. I wanted to ask a few follow-up questions and then go into a couple other areas. And as I said, we'll take questions from the audience, putting them on cards, and passing them to people who walk around the aisle and collect them. You talked about mission innovation. You used the word innovation at the start and at the end. I know how important that is to you. You talked about the commitment to double energy R&D. It's not only the amount, it's also how those funds get deployed. So can you talk about what we know in terms of return on the dollar for where it's most effective to put increased energy R&D dollars, and what role the national labs play in that, and RPE? How does that work?
Okay, so let me focus on two elements. One is one of the exercises that we are going through right now, and it's very much focused to help guide the thinking of the next team, is a portfolio analysis as to how one might focus a doubling of resources. And again, look, I'm not saying, that 2x is somehow a magical, exactly correct number, but I could give you some arguments as to why it's the right ballpark. But the idea is you still need to build the portfolio from the bottom up. You think about it differently, let's say in our case, if you're thinking about 10 billion versus 5 billion. So let me give you one example. Let's take nuclear energy. As we think about, let's say, a doubling of that R&D budget, we could go through this for all the programs, but so strategically, what are the things you want to do? You want to look at the technology requirements, the materials requirements for potentially extending the life of existing reactors, because it makes a big deal for carbon if the current reactors start to retire in droves in the 2030s versus the 2050s for meeting our goals. A lot of very fundamental work there. A second thing you want to do is you want to enable the small modular reactors as a potentially new paradigm. A third thing you want to do, which we have not had the funding to really pursue seriously, is to look for the much longer term at non-light water technology, more advanced reactors. And a fourth thing you want to do is to really do a much more extensive set of geological characterizations, et cetera, for waste management, spent fuel management. Frankly, in our current budget, we're kind of constrained. We cannot pursue all of those for sure. A doubled budget, your horizon opens up. So we are looking, not in detailed program. These are not budget lines. These are what are the strategic objectives that we want to fold into a doubling, including not just the current programs in nuclear, in renewables, in efficiency, in fossil, low carbon fossil, in sustainable transportation, but also, as I mentioned, going in whole other directions like large-scale carbon management as a supplement to those low-carbon technologies. So I think that's one of the things we're doing. Secondly, the second part, you mentioned RPE. So I made this comment about I certainly feel we have a lot of unexploited innovation potential in this country. Let me take RPE as an anecdotal example. RPE is a new way of doing business, which I won't bother to discuss here, but it's about developing somewhat high-risk technologies. It got funded in 2009 in the Recovery Act, first contract in 2010. We're now 6 years later. 200 projects through 2015 had been completed. 36 new companies, another 40 or 50 had received substantial follow-on funding without establishing a company yet, well over $1 billion of private capital. There are 10 commercial products. In the energy business, that's a pretty impressive track record in a 5 or 6 year time period. Well, last year, ARPA-E had what's called an open call for a new funding round. And an open call means you bring me your best idea, for a low carbon future. They were able to fund less than 2% of the applications. Now, you may call it anecdotal, but when you have a successful program that can only fund at that level, we got to be leaving a lot of good ideas, on the table. So that's why I have complete confidence in our ability to effectively use those funds. And that example I gave in nuclear is how we're thinking about putting together a model portfolio for the next team.
That doesn't sound at all, by the way, like the work I see the evil scientists at Hawkins National Laboratory doing on Netflix and Stranger Things. So I'm glad you clarified how the national labs actually work.
Did you see me on Chelsea Handler?
You posted it on Twitter, so of course I saw it.
Well, so I did point out that our particle physicists do work on parallel universes and higher dimensions, but not in Indiana. Actually, not true. The University of Indiana probably does some. Anyway.
I recommend it for anyone who doesn't know what I'm talking about. Netflix, Stranger Things. You mentioned carbon removal technology a few times, so let me come back to that. There's, fascinating work going on here at Columbia, many other universities and elsewhere on that. CCS, air capture, carbon utilization, mineral carbonation. Can you talk a little bit about, in deep decarbonization, what role you think carbon removal will play and what's it going to look like?
Do you mean strictly carbon removal from the atmosphere or carbon capture as well? Both. Because it's actually, that's carbon capture too, from a different medium.
Right.
Actually, I'll just give you an example. I just came from an hour ago from visiting a project at City College, which is ARPA-E funded, and it is a carbon utilization project. The idea is, it's called gas fermentation, rather than the usual kind of yeast fermentation. It's quite interesting. They're moving now to pilot scale, without discussing in detail, but it could take a whole variety of carbon sources, including flaring, what's currently flared at production, steel plants, you name it, and with different modified microbes, turn those into a variety of fuels and chemicals. And it's very interesting. It's based, and they've demonstrated at lab pilot scale an enormous increase in the ability to interface the gas and the liquid. It's getting complicated, but that's kind of the idea. But there's an example of, will it scale? Will the other hundreds of projects from ARPA-E and other sources scale? We only need a few of them to scale at a reasonable cost. So I just think we have a lot of optimism that there's more of this we have to do for large-scale carbon utilization, for conversion into products. Clearly, geological sequestration is there and can take quite a bit, but the reality is we're not going to, I don't think we're going to put 20 gigatons of CO2 underground. So we're going to need gigaton scale solutions that can use that carbon in other ways.
And how do you think the potential...
And by the way, I might add just, by the way, in addition to what we do, there's also actually 2 weeks ago out in LA, I visited X Prize, and they have a prize in terms of this large-scale carbon utilization as well. So I think if we keep coming at it at different angles, we'll get there.
I was going to ask, by way of follow-up, how you think the potential for technology like that should affect policy decisions today on hydrocarbon production and supply. The idea that there's a carbon budget, that's math, you can produce a certain amount, keep it in the ground as a growing movement, the activism around infrastructure and permits and leases to explore. How do we think about, should we think differently about that given the potential for this sort of carbon capture removal technology?
Well, look, first of all, no doubt about it. Carbon budget. Carbon long lived in the atmosphere. We can talk about it in terms of a carbon budget. And we've used up quite a bit of the budget. So we've got to respect that requirement. In doing so, we can do it with continued use of at least some reasonable level of fossil fuels. But let's look today. Because actually the president last week with Leonardo DiCaprio talked about, again, a bridge, and we can all describe the way we'd like the world to be. But the reality is it's going to take time to get there, and we have to get there in a way that respects the budget, and frankly, I don't want to go into another side alley, but respects a lot of the other demands that we must meet, like jobs, like recognizing the distributional challenges of any transformation, including the low carbon transformation. I'm sorry, I am going to go down the side alley. If you look at jobs in the energy business, we have had a substantial net increase in energy jobs in the United States. But that doesn't help the coal miners in southern West Virginia. It does help the 200,000 jobs in the solar industry that have been created, mostly in California, Nevada, Massachusetts, and New York. So that's a distributional problem. And what I want to say is I think addressing this jobs issue, the infrastructure challenges are one way of addressing that jobs issue, but addressing the jobs issue is critical for our climate agenda, because otherwise we're going to have headwinds, political headwinds. We have them. We already see them. And if we can manage that jobs challenge, the community challenge, we can make those tailwinds. Work with those communities, with our unions, with the workers. So I've forgotten what your original question was, but I'm glad I said that about jobs.
It was about how we think about permitting, leasing, the infrastructure for production today.
Well, and using fossil fuels, et cetera. And so there again, today, of course, actually it's relevant to that, you're right. The decrease in coal use in our electricity sector has been incredibly fast, from 50% to prediction of 30% this year, while natural gas has displaced it largely, plus wind. And natural gas this year, it will be probably 35%, the first time ever larger than coal. The irony, of course, is that big switch, most of that was market-driven because of the low gas prices. And that has helped our carbon emissions dramatically. It's been probably roughly half of our carbon reductions have come from that switch from coal to gas. However, for the deep decarbonization, it's also going to be true for gas, that we will need some form of capture, for example, and then utilization or sequestration. So that's why, we need to be pushing this innovation agenda now. Another thing that I just want to say in the stream of consciousness, because it really reminded me of it, is we need to get the signals pretty straight, both on the technology side and on the policy side, pretty soon. Because, again, if I use that kind of 2030 kind of time frame, kind of near epoch and longer epoch, in this business, big capital decisions in industry are decadal on timescales. They're not like, oh, sequestration just showed up in 2029, let me build a plant in 2030. It's not the way it works. So we need to get the policy signal straight, and we need to get the technology signal straight.
But how do we do that in a world where we don't know if the Supreme Court's going to uphold the Clean Power Plan, the outcome of this election?
Oh, don't worry, they're
would mean a huge, well, I mean,
No,
we have one
no,
candidate
so-
who would continue in
so-
a similar path, one who would go in totally the other direction.
So first of all, obviously the president announced his climate action plan in June of 2013. It is based upon administrative authorities. The good part of that is that we could just start doing the program, and we are. We are executing the program, and that program, I think, will certainly allow us to meet our shorter-term carbon goals. And I do want to emphasize that there is more stability in this kind of a program than might meet the eye. It's not like somebody can come in and just say, magic wand, it's gone. There are rule-making processes. There's a lot of buy-in to much of this. CAFE standards has been a negotiated thing with industry, et cetera, et cetera. Okay? I don't want to be Pollyannish about it, but, I'm reasonably confident about that. However, the president also said when he introduced the Climate Action Plan, 2009, he first said, look, we'd love to work with Congress and get legislation. And a reason for that is that using administrative authorities, and the president said this last week, does have the limitation of having to go kind of sector by sector with different rules, different policies, et cetera. Whereas what you would like, and the real clear signal to industry, would be something that is economy-wide and simple. A good example is a carbon price. Possibly with the money being directly returned to the public, you can do the various things. But that's an example of something that would be economy-wide, give a clear signal, industry can make its capital planning. Now, obviously, we don't have that today. I believe we will have it within a relatively short time. And I believe the public is moving in this direction. I believe once the fallout of an election cycle is finished, I think that'll be the time to return to this argument in a simple way. Congress, for lots of reasons, is talking about revisiting the whole tax structure, and maybe this is going to be part of the discussion. There are other ways of doing it. It doesn't have to be a carbon price. But that is certainly an example of a simple economy-wide approach.
So on this topic of bipartisanship, how to kind of get the congressional action we would need to go beyond what can be done with executive authority, I was interested, I don't know if you saw this, in a Pew Research Center survey that came out a week ago about how political orientation affects views on climate and trust in climate scientists. Let me just, I'll mention one or two of the stats. When asked, climate scientists should have a major role in policy decisions, 80% of liberal Democrats say yes, only 48% of conservative Republicans. Climate scientists understand very well whether climate change is occurring. 68% of liberal Democrats say yes, only 18% of conservative Republicans. And the partisan differences in that survey were limited to the views of climate scientists. There was broad agreement when you ask about scientists generally. You only see that partisan difference when they ask about climate scientists. You're a scientist. You're also one of the top political leaders. So I wanted to ask you, how do we build consensus on the issue of climate change when you see this type of polarization on the issue?
First of all, Mother Nature is a great ally. And she is speaking louder and louder. And there may be a little confusion between weather and climate sometimes, but I firmly believe that this is one thing that's going to help move this. But secondly, this partisan polarization on this question, I'm not questioning the Pew study. I'm sure it's done very, very well. I kind of instinctively believe the results. But I'm not sure that represents a very deeply held views in that polarization. Look, let's face it, we've had a highly polarizing, dysfunctional discussion in the Congress and elsewhere. It has somehow or another, I would argue almost inexplicably, devolved into being some kind of political party issue. I just have to believe that's going to go away. It doesn't make any sense. It just doesn't make any sense. Now, there are some correlations in our country, obviously, between geography and, resource-producing regions, et cetera, and political results over the last decades. But I just cannot believe that we're not going to start moving in these next years towards, frankly, what I would call the American approach. We got a problem, we recognize it, we solve it. We're pragmatic about going after it. And maybe it's because of the scientist in me that I'm just inherently optimistic, because this separation along party lines just doesn't make sense. We know we have many strong Republican voices. One of my dear friends, George Shultz, for example, who couldn't be more clear about the need to address this. It's not partisan at all, and he's not alone. We know industry. A lot of industry is, let's say, reticent in the current political environment, but frankly, very eager to get the signal and to start making capital planning. Look, we know a lot of companies already use shadow carbon prices in their asset allocations. So it's happening, and I believe it will happen.
So just a reminder for those watching online and listening to our podcast, I'm Jason Bordoff with Columbia SEPA Center on Global Energy Policy. We're joined here in New York City on the Columbia campus by the U.S. Secretary of Energy, Dr. Ernest Moniz. You talked about how often people look at the electricity sector when you see what decarbonization looks like. And then you mentioned transport, you mentioned the industrial sector. Do you think that decarbonization in those sectors means electrification or not necessarily?
No, so is certainly critical, precisely because we can see further electrification in these other sectors, especially transportation, where obviously electric vehicles will come in. But I just don't believe that electrification is the entire solution. Certainly, a good example in the transportation sector would be, and obviously kind of it's extreme in a certain sense, but air travel. Is probably not going to be electrified anytime soon. But you have heavy vehicles, you have necessary off-road vehicles in a whole bunch of industries. You have people who live in areas that are quite lightly populated and drive long distances, and there is no doubt that the energy density of a hydrocarbon fuel is the highest that you're going to get. So I think we have a lot more room for electrifying transportation than comes out of the various models, including the ones that we run at DOE. But I think it's going to have to. It's also efficiency. It's also alternative liquid fuels. And frankly, to me, again, going back to the carbon utilization, a huge holy grail would be sustainable drop-in hydrocarbon fuels. That is, we know we can do it. We don't know yet how to do it at anything like the scale and the cost. But that's an example of the kind of innovation we need over the long haul. And then industry, I want to say, industry, you do have opportunities especially for very large sources with carbon capture and sequestration or carbon capture and utilization. But a lot of energy use in industries, manufacturing industry, it's process heat. That's not so easy to electrify in any sensible way. You can do it in principle, but so that's why I think we need to have a lot more innovation and bring in those carbon management possibilities.
You talked about some of the work that you're doing, that DOE is doing, rethinking energy security. You talked about the SBR in particular. So I wanted to ask about, beyond sort of oil sitting in salt caverns in the Gulf Coast and how to rethink the right use of that, kind of as we think about a decarbonization, a low-carbon transition, what new kind of energy security risks you think the U.S. government needs to be paying attention to, whether it's from electrification and cyber risk, or increased use of gas and connection of our gas markets to global markets? What are the things we should be thinking about?
Well, I think on gas, again, gas, first of all, has, as we said earlier, has had enormous impacts in the power sector. It's also had enormous impacts throughout the economy because of the low price of gas and what it means for manufacturing costs, et cetera. But for the long term, there's a big argument going on. I may as well just say it. There's a big argument going on about what is or is not the role of so-called baseload electricity in the longer term. In the 2030s, nuclear power, for example. And so some argue, well, baseload power is a Paleolithic concept that will just go away because, well, we can have variable renewables and natural gas can match the loads, et cetera, et cetera. And technically, I think that's probably possible. But I think in terms of system design, natural gas compared to renewables, efficiency, and nuclear, natural gas is the only one of those whose cost is very much tied to the fuel cost. The others have very low or, quotes, zero fuel cost. So it's capital. Capital, you know what you're paying, right? If you have a high technology that is dependent on the fuel cost, that is a vulnerability, a risk. It's a risk factor. So you want to make sure the portfolio is balanced, I think, in the right way. Now, I'm not predicting high gas prices anytime soon, natural gas prices. I think the fundamentals look like, reasonable pricing. But I don't see how you can predict that for the longer term, and we would be very vulnerable. So I think, we need a good mix. Natural gas will play a big role. Renewables will play a big role. I think something like nuclear, maybe carbon capture, will also play important roles.
You made a passing reference to the role of U.S. LNG in the global markets. Can you say a little bit more about what impact you think it has had? It just started, and will have in the next couple going forward on pricing, on integration, on geopolitics, on energy security around the world?
Well, I think the biggest impact that U.S. LNG exports have had so far is in not having LNG imports, which was expected to, of course, be enormous by now. A lot of capital invested, and that's not how it panned out. So first of all, those cargoes have gone elsewhere, number one. Number two, the United States is still in the early stages, clearly, but by 2020, 2021, we will probably be the third largest LNG exporter in the world, somewhere around 10 billion cubic feet per day, along with Qatar and Australia, which is also coming into the market heavily. But I think the big thing now is already in these early stages, we should remember that in contrast to a pipe, which has point A and point B, LNG, in principle, you can arbitrage, you can move cargoes around. And that has led to in my view, a surprisingly rapid development of new contract structures, renegotiated contracts for, oil-pegged LNG. And so now clearly the lower oil prices have helped in that, but still the amount of spot contracts, et cetera, is growing rapidly. And suddenly, where Japan was paying, $17 for LNG, now they're paying $6 or $7. Less. Even less now, maybe. And Europe is similarly. So it's a whole different world. We still have an advantage in the United States because we are unique in the degree of our coincidence of supply and demand. So we don't have those big supply chain costs to move gas. But it's a whole different world already in LNG, in natural gas.
Some of these questions as I go. There's one here about do you believe nuclear power plants should be used to reduce carbon emissions in the electricity sector? So, broaden that, your view of the role of nuclear and also advanced nuclear technologies, what role you think they'll play?
Yeah, well, I think, look, again, it's a simple fact that today nuclear power remains by far our biggest, again, quotes, zero carbon source, and certainly one of the things that and by the way, a lot of environmental groups have also raised as big concerns is the shutdown of a number of existing nuclear plants in so-called deregulated markets. It's true we are building 5 plants, one of which is the completion of an old plant by TVA, which is coming online fully pretty soon, and 4 new ones in the southeast. But yeah, from a carbon point of view, we are concerned about that, and certainly having nuclear as part of the portfolio of zero carbon opportunities in the future, I think will be very important. Now, one of the directions that I personally, I'm not saying it's the answer, but I want to make sure we find out the answer, is in moving to small modular reactors. So for those who don't know, what that means is a new generation of nuclear power plants that rather than being 1,000 or 1,400 megawatts is maybe 50 to 200 megawatts, somewhere in that range. And the Department of Energy is now supporting a 50 megawatt such technology that will be going to the Nuclear Regulatory Commission this year. They still tell us they're going this year to the NRC for their design certification. So this is not some pie in the sky kind of thing. I would say we still don't know what its cost performance will be until we do it. But we got to do it, and I hope we will do it in the early part of the next decade. What I want to emphasize is these technologies have some very attractive safety features, but what I want to emphasize in this context is what could be very important is the different financial structures that may be available to much smaller plants than for 1,400 megawatt plants. And, I should note that if you weight the capital cost of wind or solar, which have had tremendous cost reductions in the last years, but if you weight their capital cost per unit, per megawatt, weighted by capacity factor, nuclear, wind, solar are kind of in the same ballpark. Frankly, nuclear may even be a little bit less. But the enormous difference is you can invest in wind and solar in a very, very different way. You can build a 100 megawatt, solar farm, which now we have 45 of them in the United States, et cetera. So like a 50 megawatt reactor may have that attraction also of a different financial structure.
I think you answered this already, but let me just make sure, because the technical details were pretty finely worded in the Iran deal. But in your view, how would you would judge Iran as complying so far? They're meeting the terms of the agreement. Is that correct? correct?
The IAEA is the official arbiter of this, and they have done 3 reports, all of which said that Iran is following the agreement. Okay. One report, I forget if it was the first or the second one, noted that they have a limit of 130 tons of heavy water, and they were notified by the inspectors, we measured 130.7, and they immediately, corrected that. And so, I mean, it's very complicated, but IAEA has now 3 times come back with a clean sheet.
And you noted how there are questions on the Iranian side. Sometimes you said the U.S. is fulfilling its side of the agreement, but a lot of existing sanctions remain in place unrelated to this deal, which in some cases has challenged or discouraged companies from going in and investing. So the fact...
Many factors.
Yeah, but I guess the question I had for you was, should if business is not coming into Iran as quickly as they had expected, if the perception might grow among Iranian people that this deal's not working out for us the way we hoped, should that be a concern for U.S. policymakers?
Absolutely, and it is.
And what can we do about it?
And that's why Secretary Kerry has made it very clear and walked the talk. For example, he and Secretary Lew from Treasury, Jack Lew, just even recently again, they went to meet with bankers in London, in Paris, in Frankfurt, to make it clear that, look, you can do business in Iran. Here's the rules, if you like. But I think it just takes time for business and banks to build up confidence that they know who they're dealing with. To be honest, I think, Iran, their banking sector was pretty isolated for quite a few years. They need to really up the game in terms of, how to do due diligence and and transparency. That's a factor. A lot of mid-sized banks have opened up banking relationships with Iran. So it's not like nothing has happened. It's just that the very big banks that have, more exposure in a certain sense are being cautious. But I think there's also a little bit of a chicken and egg, because until you have large foreign direct investment in Iran, the financial motivations for big banks is also limited, right? Because, clearing checks is not exactly a high margin business. So that's why I think it's a question of building it up. It's what we always try to emphasize. Again, the oil sector came back, in our view, in my personal view, came back much faster than I expected. They're essentially at pre-sanctions levels. Things are happening. The United States did provide licenses for the purchase of civilian aircraft, which is an enormously important thing in Iran, because of the long sanctions regime. There's a lot of safety challenges. So things are happening. It's a question of what's going to be the timescale as business and the banking sector gain confidence and feel that they have the transparency that they need to be able to do business and not be subject to some of the other sanctions that remain in place.
So we only have a few minutes left. There are still several topics that we didn't have a chance to get to, unfortunately, and questions we didn't have a chance to get to, unfortunately. But let me just ask you to reflect a bit as the administration comes to a close in how many days was it? So 99 days.
Or minus 8 hours.
We know presidents do this. I don't know if you'll do it for your successor, but if you were to kind of draft a note and leave it on the desk for whoever comes in the next day, things you wish you had known on day one that you think your successor should know on day one that you wish you knew, what would you say?
First of all, we're not going to leave a note. We're going to leave binders. I mean, shelves of papers. By the way, many of which by the administration has decided, many of which will be public. So we're putting together a whole set of transition papers and options. I'm going to quibble with your question a little bit in the sense that, I was a little bit unusual in that I'd been around this track before as undersecretary. And when I was in the department as undersecretary, there was only one undersecretary. The point of that being had a lot of visibility across the department. So that comparison, I think, is not the right thing. However, we are obviously committed to leaving the new team and a new person who may not have that background in the Department of Energy. Historically, that's not been the case. With key issues, some of them I already outlined. For example, I certainly hope that the innovation agenda is front and center. That's where the department has a very special role to play, and a very critical one, in my view, for the long-term solutions to climate. I mentioned things like on emergency response. I mentioned it here. Perhaps we need to have a fundamental reorganization. We may not recommend that, but we need to put forward options and pros and cons, and why the world has changed. By the way, actually, as an aside on that, when I came back to DOE in 2013, after having left, at the end of the Clinton administration, the specific issues, obviously evolve a lot and change, and climate was way elevated in importance, et cetera, et cetera. But I wouldn't say that there was any area of the department I could not recognize. 12 years of evolution. I wasn't exactly on Mars either, so I was watching, what was going on. The one exception, I might argue, is emergency response in the energy sector. The Department of Energy always had emergency response responsibilities for nuclear things because we have the nuclear expertise in our labs. But energy emergency response, to a very good approximation, didn't exist at that time. And after 9/11 and other things developing, it's now growing into a major thing, where, as I said, responsibilities and resources remain to be aligned, shall we say. And personally, I think that's where somebody else has to make the judgment in the next administration. Personally, I think it may be difficult to align the resources with the responsibilities without having a clear, defined organizational focus for all aspects of emergency response, from grids to petroleum reserves. Now, that's controversial. I'll probably hear it when I get back to DOE, but I think that's the kind of thinking that it's for us to lay out what the options are. Organizational changes should never be easily done, easily addressed, because they create a lot of grinding and et cetera. But sometimes you got to recognize that things have changed, and including, by the way, the Department of Energy was a creature of the 1970s and the oil embargoes, et cetera. A lot of things have changed. We've already touched upon some of them in the discussion.
In our final minute, I just want to ask, we have a lot of students in this room who aspire to careers in public service, and as someone who's moved between academia and the very highest levels of public service, you have spent a lot of time talking to students. What advice do you give them about sort of how to move into that world and how to move forward for a career in the energy sector and public service?
Well, for one thing, and it's not only about public service, it's about whatever they're going to do. What I counsel is, if it feels right, if it's interesting, just do it. Because certainly, frankly, without that attitude, I wouldn't have gone to government in the first place, way back in 1995. And actually, when I left that first job at OSTP and went back to MIT, my department headship had been left, the seat was left warm, and that was it. That was it. I was back to MIT. That lasted 3 months until I got the phone call, how about coming back to be Undersecretary of DOE? And I said, DOE is a weird department. It's a major supporter of science, which I love. It does all the clean energy R&D, which I love. It does nuclear security, which I've been doing for a long time. What the hell? Sure, let's go back. And I just think, that students should not get, too enamored of one track. Look, we all understand, it can be risky. There are issues, there could be family structures and concerns. But in the end, I just think, you got to have fun and do things that you like. And that would include public service, but not exclusively.
Well, we're all fortunate that you answered the call yes and went back into government many times in public service, and we're very fortunate that you spent time with us here in New York today. We hope you'll do it many more times. Please join me in thanking Energy Secretary Ernest.